Okay, great. So, Sean, hi first again, and thanks for coming.
Great to be here.
If you could give people just a baby rundown of who you are and where you came from and what you did that got you here, etc.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess at least the part of the program that got me, I think, most to where I am now is my wife opened a Spanish tapas restaurant in New York in 2004, and had a horrible job working in advertising, and I started helping out running food at the restaurant, and I was just, you know, bitten by the bug, as it were. So I just kind of fell in love with the camaraderie and being around food and wine and the whole thing. And I pretty quickly decided that I wanted to make restaurants my career. And I went to work at a restaurant called Chanterelle, which was a fine dining restaurant that was a 4-star restaurant at one point. But anyway, the short story is I did the whole fine dining thing, got sucked into wine. Roger DeGorn was the sommelier and a master sommelier at Chanterelle. So I got sucked down the wine path, did that whole thing, worked at Per Se, did the fine dining thing. And my interest in wine ultimately, and part of it was just in studying wine, I had to also study spirits in order to do, I got my certified sommelier from the Quartermaster Sommeliers and my sommelier certificate from the American Sommelier Association. And so I had to delve into spirits a little bit. And, I think it's that thing too. It's like once you're used to doing deductive tasting, I was pretty fascinated by, especially we're talking like 2005, 2006, when you look at American whiskey quality relative to price. And this is really shortening the story, but falling in love with bourbon and wanting to open my own restaurant and deciding that, there are enough wine bars out there, especially this is 2008, that there was like a wine bar boom. And no one was, really not only in New York, but throughout the country, no one was really doing American whiskey focused bar. So I opened a bar called Char Number 4, which, at the time was, I think, pretty forward thinking in terms of, there weren't really many places that had, on the one hand, an encyclopedic selection of American whiskey. And then also I had a chef who'd worked for Daniel Boulud for 10 years. So he was from Texas. So I think, easy for me to say, I think the food was really great. So we're kind of executing really high level, high quality food, making our own sausage, making our own bacon, in Brooklyn, 2008. It was a moment in time, and, hanging our hats on this American whiskey thing. And it was really that, opening 2 more restaurants that were focused, American whiskey focused, and wanting to get kind of closer to the process that led me to ultimately acquire some barrels and kind of get Pinhook going.
Okay, so in that vein, and as a point of reference, the Char Number 4 that he's talking about, it was in encyclopedia. Like, think of the biggest wine list you see, but just of whiskey from America, which was astounding to my 23-year-old brain when I saw it at the time, and it was a whole back bar of it. Can you talk about what the landscape of American whiskey was at that time as a buyer and a curator, and how that propelled you to Pinhook?
Yeah, it was interesting. So at that time, the category was very small. So if you think of Maker's Mark as an easy example, in 2008, Maker's Mark made one product, just their straight Maker's Mark that we all know. I think now they have at least 5, possibly 6 different products. There was one Knob Creek, there was one Woodford. So you think about all the major distilleries, the craft distillery, not just in the American whiskey realm, but basic gin, et cetera, didn't exist. There was St. George single malt out of California. Actually, appropriately, Stranahan's from Colorado was on the market at the time. Hudson Baby Bourbon was around, and that kind of represented the entire world of craft. And so everything else was just the major distilleries that we all know, which at the time produced a pretty limited number of kind of standard products. And so what was kind of cool was, in trying to represent the world of American whiskey, we were essentially able to put the entire world of American whiskey on these shelves and give people the opportunity, both visually and then in terms of tasting, to kind of see everything that was out there. And a lot of it, which was fun, was kind of being able to point and be like, hey, what's that really bright yellow label next to the Jim Beam. And you're like, oh, that's, this. And we did them alphabetically. So it was just alphabetically, from top to bottom. And, now if I'd had shelves of the same size, it would have to be a really carefully edited selection because, like I said, Maker's Mark has a lot more products out there. Everyone has a lot more products out there. So I would have had to more pick and choose, but this was more just representative of everything that was out there. And there was no Pappy Van Winkle as we know it now. There were no cult whiskeys. I thought about this math the other day, right? So Elijah Craig 18 at the time was a $35 wholesale bourbon, right? It was a $48 on the shelf item. Those original bottles sell for $600 on the secondary market now.
That's so crazy.
So if I had I could have called Southern Wine and Spirits that distributed Heaven Hill or Elijah Craig. I could have picked up the phone, ordered 500 six-packs of Elijah Craig 18, which they would not have batted an eye at. They had plenty of it. My cost would have been $105,000, and it would be worth $2 million right now.
Oh my God. That's like when Scott talks about buying Bordeaux for Lucas in bulk. Like the Mouton costs like basically negative. It's like the price of oil in the last week. What?
Here's a $29.99 bottle of Jefferson.
Oh yeah.
91 Stitzel-Weller distilled.
Oh man, yeah.
$29.99 bottle.
Stuff is so good.
So we were talking about how that gave you the opportunity to like know the foundation of grammar before the language of whiskey evolved.
Yeah.
And how it gave you like such an amazing window into, the base of every style. And then as they evolved, like we talked about, into the equivalent of Grand Reservas or whatever. So can you talk about how you sort of segued into Pinhook from that experience of char number 4?
Yeah. So what really interested me was, like I said, on the one hand, coming from the wine side, I was super fascinated by the quality of bourbon relative to price. But then, as I said, also, it seemed like the category was relatively narrow because the laws, I'm not going to turn this into a bourbon lesson, but the laws are quite strict. And essentially you're saying like, you have to use 51% corn. It has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel. There are other rules, but I think those are the two that most directly influence the flavor profile. And so if you break those rules, you can't call it bourbon. And it seemed limiting. And so I was kind of curious as someone who loved bourbon. And I thought, and this was at the time before it blew up, in my head, I was kind of like, if we're going to continue to make this category interesting to people, there needs to be more diversity in terms of the offerings. There needs to be different ways of thinking about how to, assemble it and put it together. And coming from the wine side, the thing that made the most sense to me was vintages, right? Which is typically in bourbon in the industry, and still most of what's out there is based around this idea that you have natural ingredients, grain, yeast, water, these barrels which are made from trees. You can't add anything else to them. And, there are variables in grain harvest, mineral content in water, the barrels themselves. One barrel makes one tree. The grain of the wood is different. So there are all these variables. And typically what happens in the industry is you are trying to take all these variables and figure out how to work around them so that each blend or batch tastes identical to the prior one. So you have a set flavor profile at a set proof, and you're just trying to replicate that over and over and over again, essentially for eternity, right? So the idea that if I bought a bottle of Maker's Mark 10 years ago and I go and pull one off the shelf today, if they did their job, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two bottles, which is great. So saying that is not a criticism. It was just more, like I said, trying to think about a different approach. And that led me to this idea, again, coming from a wine perspective, of what if you looked at each group of barrels as an opportunity to create the most delicious whiskey you could, with no preconceived notion of what the flavor profile should be or what the proof is. So each one, like a wine vintage, is being treated as an opportunity to simply produce the best thing you can for the vintage.
So I want to weave in at some point the idea of a master taster and how you got to that. So you have this idea of, instead of backed into, you said earlier that producers then therefore have to back themselves into the flavor profile instead of like pushing out through the best exclusive vintage. So then how did you execute that under the name of Pinhook, not from really an investor point of view, but from an ideological point of view through a partnership with MGP?
So one thing, so what was interesting at the time is like MGP is now, at least for people in, you know, in the industry, is something that everyone knows about. At the time, and I would also say, in fairness, I was not in the industry. I was a bar owner, you know, and like any bar owner, I was, you know, just talking to suppliers, talking to my sales reps. But I didn't have any sort of behind the scenes understanding of what goes on in the industry. I'd never heard of MGP. And actually, it was called LDI at the time, Lawrenceburg Distillers Incorporated. And so when I first, in 2010, had the idea that with two friends of mine, that we wanted to acquire some barrels and work on this vintage idea and just play around with blending and proofing and all that kind of stuff, I just started asking around. I didn't know how one acquired barrels. And to be honest, I don't remember. It took me a while. So again, now it's this common knowledge thing, but it took a lot of phone calls and asking different people and asking big distilleries like Heaven Hill, like, hey, I'd love to buy some barrels from you. I've got this bar in Brooklyn, and being told, you know, in no uncertain terms that that was never going to happen. To finally, quote unquote, discover MGP, you know, one of the largest distilleries in the country, and realize that once you've figured out that they were there, that you could simply pick up the phone and be like, hey, I want to buy some bourbon. And they're like, great, how much do you want? 20 barrels, 2,000 barrels, 20,000 barrels, like whatever you want. We've got plenty of bourbon for you. And so that was, you know, that was really the first step, was how do we get our hands on barrels? And then because, you know, at the time, and it started to change recently, you couldn't actually go to MGP, right? So you couldn't physically go there and check in on your barrels. The whole point of what we were trying to do was understand how different the barrels were from each other, figure out how to put them together, understand how they were changing as they were aging, all that kind of stuff. So we needed to be able to touch them. And so the other thing that took a while to figure out was who out there had a license to be able to store the barrels, and then when the time came, dump, filter, proof, bottle. So we found this place called Strong Spirits, which still exists in Bardstown, Kentucky, and we shipped our 20 barrels there. And that was, we bought 20 barrels of 3-year-old bourbon for $465 a barrel. So if you think about it, it would be like, just for the distillate, we were paying $1.75 per 750 milliliter bottle for 3-year-old bourbon, which is not, you know, how it goes anymore.
Yeah, that's like what you pay maybe for a shot of something.
Yeah. So that was, you know, that's kind of where we started. And you know, for the other thing which I kind of left out was I hadn't really spent any time in Kentucky. And I think, you know, I'm not sure if there's like a perfect wine analogy for it, but certainly when it comes to bourbon, if you want to understand what bourbon is all about, you feel like Kentucky is the place. And even though now there are lots of great craft distilleries all around the country, you know, at the time I was kind of like, hadn't visited many of these distilleries, hadn't spent any time there. And so that was a big part of it too, was sending the barrels to Kentucky. And then subsequently, we spent 3 years before our first release, you know, going to Kentucky 4 to 5 times a year, checking in on the barrels, tasting, getting a better understanding of how they were evolving, and then just visiting other distilleries and just, you know, taking in the whole, you know, the whole magic of Kentucky.
So where did you buy those 20 barrels from? And then after you buy them and then they come with you to Kentucky and then they go to MGP? Is that the?
No. So we bought them from MGP in Indiana. And then, you know, you just hire a trucking company. They put them on a truck. They drove them to Bardstown, Kentucky. And that was it. Bardstown is about an hour drive from Lexington, which is where, you know, one of the I found it with two very close friends of mine, Charles Fulford and Jay Peterson. And it was Jay's friend, Jamie, who grew up in thoroughbred horse racing, that we would stay with in Kentucky. And so that's ultimately how this whole other piece, kind of came together around the horses, was, going to Kentucky, staying at Jamie's house in Lexington, driving to Bardstown, checking in on our barrels, and, trying to piece it all together.
And then staying sober enough to drive back.
Yeah.
I don't remember how that part works.
Hey, Sean,
There weren't many people on the road.
Sean, when you were experiencing and discovering Kentucky, what would you say a couple of the maybe most important influences on what has become Pinhook? What would you reference as some of those points along your path?
Yeah, I think it was, even though it's obvious, I would say, at least for me and Charles, Jay had some experience around it, but, Lexington is this very charming kind of small town, and Keeneland, which is the racetrack there, is, some people say, one of the most beautiful racetracks in the world, let alone in America. And it's all these old stone buildings and the rolling hills, and, it's, and while it's not, the Kentucky Derby, it's, people dress up a bit. Everyone's, people are making their little gambling bets. Everyone's dressed up. I mean, it's this kind of amazing experience. So I think it was really hanging out with him at Keeneland, and then just kind of like hanging out at these various little thoroughbred centric, spots, and dabbling in that kind of, gave us this sort of, I guess, behind the curtains, behind the scenes look into thoroughbred horse racing, and something that is so essential to Kentucky. And, while you could say it's very obvious, we went to Kentucky to have an experience around bourbon and to learn more about bourbon. We ended up having all these experiences around horses, and it turns out, of course, that those are the two things that Kentucky's best known for. But I think we felt like we had a perspective that at least felt fresh to us, and really informed our approach.
Nice. And then how did that lead you to Castle and Key, which seems like from pictures it's made of the same stone you're talking about?
Yeah. So really, ultimately, I guess we got kind of lucky through Jamie. So it was this combination of, when we first got there, we were trying to look at different options, and Jamie had introduced us to someone who was an attorney, a liquor attorney, and her husband, Will Arvin, was the guy who decided to buy the distillery. So just to back up for a second, the Old Taylor Distillery is one of the most important distilleries in the history of American whiskey. Colonel Taylor is one of the most important figures. He built the distillery in 1887. And you want to talk about someone being ahead of his time. He had been traveling in Europe, and he'd been in Scotland, and he'd been in England, he'd gone to Bordeaux. And he had this idea that he wanted to build a tourist destination that would help promote the Kentucky bourbon tourism industry in 1887. Like, you want to talk, they're just figuring that out now, to be honest, on some
world.
So, the reason it's called Castle and Key, they obviously can't call it the Old Taylor Distillery because Buffalo Trace owns that label. He built a castle. The main reason that he picked the site was because of a spring. Water is the most important ingredient in whiskey, so there's a ground spring on the site. He built a keyhole-shaped well, this huge peristyle well around the spring, because he said the water was the key to his whiskey. He had a railroad track built so that people could basically come on, in addition to grain, that folks could come directly to the distillery on a train. He built a little train depot, which is still there, that he called Taylorton Station. He was a pretty modest dude. He built this incredible, it's 113 acres. There's the spring, there's Glens Creek, this beautiful water running through the property. And, long story short, the bourbon industry really started to fall apart in the early 70s. Things like vodka came on the scene, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately the distillery was shut down and just sat there, you know, for close to 50 years, essentially just rotting, roofs caving in. And so Will, who I mentioned, and we had actually gone and looked at this property before he bought it. I always like to mention this story to Will because, you know, for those of you who've worked in restaurants, and my wife and I together opened 5 restaurants, like you have to be a bit of a nut to be in the restaurant business in any capacity, certainly as a restaurant owner. And I remember looking with my friends or my partners looking at this property because we ducked under the fence and we we're like, hey, this thing is for sale for $850,000. That's what it was, 113 acres. The whole thing was for sale for 850 grand. And that included 2 rick houses, one that holds 30,000 barrels, one that holds 45,000 barrels that were still essentially intact. One of them needed new ricks, but you know, there was a lot there. And we were like, you'd have to be batshit crazy to tackle a project like this. Just like the sheer mechanical infrastructure of plumbing and electricity. I mean, it was just a mess. So the fact that folks that we actually know were the ones that decided to bite off this pretty insane project. And because of that, they knew that in order to have a working model, they needed to have contracts, meaning they needed to find people that would pay them to make whiskey for them. And we were the first people they approached. And this was before they'd hired a distilling team. This is before they'd hired a single person. And they came to us and they were like, what do you think? Would you guys make whiskey here with us, essentially? And it was just a combination of the history and having spent time there. And so it was a no-brainer. And so we were like, without even knowing like what it was going to taste like and any of those, we essentially committed to saying like, yes, we're in.
So what's the timeline difference between when you have those first 20 barrels that you bought from MGP and that conversation?
So first barrels we bought from MGP were 2011. That conversation was 2016. We moved all of our barrels from Bardstown to Castle and Key in 2017.
Then, sorry, now how has that gone since then?
So, I mean, amazingly, you know, we've released a rye, Ride On, which we released, losing track of time in these weird coronavirus universe, but relatively recently, I guess, you know, February, March, depending on where in the country, we released our first rye that was made there, which in turn was the first whiskey to come out of the Old Taylor Distillery since it shut down in 1972. And it's a 2.5-year-old rye. And then coming your way to Colorado, I think on a truck, should be there soon. Our first bourbon as well, which is a high proof bourbon, almost 3 years old, 114.5 proof. So, and then that in turn will be the first bourbon to come out of Old Taylor since it shut down in 1972. So it's kind of fun to have just started by sourcing barrels, and then now it's not our distillery, but to have had a hand in picking the mash bills, the yeasts, and really getting to see it from the start, and to now have aged it 100% in one spot and now see this stuff in a bottle, which, yeah, there it is. And we get to put the magic words Kentucky in front of straight rye whiskey, which is awesome. And so Ride On is the horse, and then we have Bohemian Bourbon, the high proof edition, and also.
To your point about the yeast, like the ambient yeast, the ambient temperature, just like in wine, affects those, like sort of affects the development. So the take from MGP to your friend's house and vice versa, if it gets transported, does that change?
I think so. They're using cultivated yeasts, and so the experience that I got to have was more around actually tasting different mash bills with different yeasts. So when I picked what are now our Pinhook Rye and Pinhook Bourbon mash bills, I was tasting different combinations of grains with different yeasts. And I guess to be fair, I was a horrible, and it's being proven even more now that I'm homeschooling my kids, like the worst science student. So I never really dug into the science, and I was really just looking at what I thought tasted the most complex, had the most depth, and simply tasted the best. So those were my parameters when I selected what are now, and the other cool thing too, which is worth mentioning, is Castle and Key makes whiskey for themselves. Castle and Key has other whiskey contracts, but our mash bill is proprietary to us, the combination of our grains and yeasts. So, we went from this moment with MGP where essentially, and I'll mention some of the bigger names, Bullet, High West, probably being the biggest two. But, from Smooth Ambler to James E. Pepper to Redemption and on it. So many people source from MGP, and I think everybody does their own thing with it in terms of how they blend, how they proof, and how they approach. But it's pretty cool to go from something where you could say essentially anybody has access to it. And there's so many brands that already exist that are using not only MGP distillate, but the exact same mash bill as us, to now something that is 100% unique to Pinhook. So pretty fun transition over the course of, coming up on 10 years since we first founded the company.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I think that's a good thing to underscore, because earlier you said that anybody at some point could buy anything from MGP with any sort of mash bill. So how did you develop your mash bill? I know it's different for each, but can you talk about that development of it and what it is?
Yeah, I think you mentioned before, like, how do you become a master taster? I think, fortunately, it's one of those things that has no requirements. So I just got to assign myself the title. Like, but what does it mean to me? I'm the one who gets to decide what goes in the bottle. So I don't know if that's a master taster or not. It's like the industry term. But I really relied, to be honest, on all of my wine training. So I spent a lot of time grinding it out in my blind tasting groups and doing my wine tests and tasting wine regularly. And to me, it's always really important that I like to say that I never learned how to taste whiskey, right? I think people work at distilleries and they do whatever sensory training the distillery offer. They have some whole program. I've never been a part of that program. My program was tasting wine, tasting wine, tasting wine, tasting wine. And I think, and loving to cook. And I feel like developing a palate that I trusted, and then simply trying to make the most delicious whiskey I can. So I think that my approach was totally unscientific, which was tasting these mash bills, again, with different percentages. And, also thinking about wine. And I think one of the big differences between wine and whiskey is that at least the better wine is always thought of in terms of complexity, not in terms of trying to hit a flavor profile. Whereas bourbon, even though it's meant to be, ostensibly complex, is all about what is the flavor profile. And so the approach with Pinhook is there is no flavor profile. So I think about it like wine, right? I'm looking for aromatic complexity on the palate, balance, length of finish, mouthfeel/texture, and alcohol integration. And so those are my benchmarks for what I think represents a good Pinhook whiskey. I don't care if one time it has a note of cinnamon and another time it has a note of clove or anise. It doesn't really matter to me. It's about the balance. And I think that's something I really relate to wine, where I think from vintage to vintage, you would look to a good winemaker to say, well, based on how the harvest is, they're still trying to have a stylistic approach to how they put wine together, but they're not trying to hit a note or a series of notes.
Is there something that you find yourself drawn to in that same vein, like a particular source of a particular char level, a particular, ratio that you?
I think that the thing that's so interesting about bourbon is because, as I was saying at the beginning, one barrel from one tree, 2 barrels filled on the same day, with the same mash bill, aging right next to each other, and the rick house can taste wildly different from each other, right? So it's more about, even if the mash bills are all the same, and even if they all aged in the same place, and even if they're all the same age, there's so much variability. So it's about which barrels go with which barrels to produce the best possible product. Like that's the part that I find fascinating. And I like Scott, who actually was a real chef. I'm apparently not a real anything. Well, I do have a sommelier certificate, but I love to cook. And I really do think, because I'll be more than anyone, the first person to admit, I don't know how to distill. Like if you tried to throw me into the distillery and be like, have at it, mister, like I literally would not be able to do a thing. But, a lot of chefs don't produce all the ingredients, the spices, they don't raise the poultry or the beef, and they don't grow the vegetables. And so I really think of it a lot like cooking, which I love to do, which is like, how do I take all these ingredients and assemble them to make the most delicious thing that I can?
So then to that, I guess I was under the impression, and this is probably very faulted, that sort of every rye release was, I don't know, different. So in this particular case, if you're talking about rye humor versus ride on, as we now have ride on to sell, it's a different.
Oh, so we did switch. So in that case, ride on is our Castle and Key distillate, and rye humor is our MGP distillate. But even to the 2 ryes that you had bourbon and rye was the first rye we ever released. That was a 2-year-old rye. And then you had Ride On, which was a 3-year-old rye. But I guess my point is, even if next year we release another 2.5-year-old Castle and Key rye, and it has the identical mash bill, I wouldn't expect it to taste the same, because of all the variability that I was discussing in the barrels. And the fact that just because of the way a blend comes together, the other thing that we do that is unique to the industry is I pick whatever I think is the perfect proof, or as we call it, like the true proof for that blend. So I'm tasting the blend at 10 to 15 different proofs to find the proof that I think is the best expression. So usually what's typical in the industry is, this is our bourbon, this is our flavor profile. It's always 90 proof. It's always 86 proof. It's bottled in bond. It's always 100 proof. Whatever that might be. Whereas this is truly open to the idea of like, hey, we need to do a 150 barrel blend of rye for the year. These are the barrels we have available to us. We're going to taste more than 150 barrels to get a sense of the entire landscape of the barrels that are available, and then play around with all of these different combinations of the barrels in order to figure out how we can make the tastiest whiskey possible. And again, with no interest in replicating a certain flavor profile.
So then going forward with each new release, how will you distinguish it from the previous release as it relates to the expression of that growing season?
So that's, one thing that we did so there are other brands that will have essentially, there is this year's release of Pappy versus last year's versus next year's. But they don't actually put anything on the bottle to indicate that. So we have vintages on our bottles, right? So Bohemian Bourbon is, 2020. And so the other thing, though, of course, is that every year we pick a new horse, or Jamie, our partner, picks whichever horse in his stable he thinks has the best shot at making the Kentucky Derby or being, a champion thoroughbred. And all the ryes for the vintage are connected to that horse, and then all the bourbons for the vintage are connected to that horse. So it's something where if you had 4 consecutive vintages of, let's say, Castle and Key rye all next to each other, and they all have a green top, they're all going to have a different vintage date on them, and they're all going to have a different horse on them, a different. So Noli Novak, who's the artist who does the portraits for the Wall Street Journal, does a hand drawing of the horse. Each one will have a different horse on it. And my hope, like I said, would be that if you taste those 4 ryes, hopefully what connects them is that kind of balanced and harmonious profile and great alcohol integration, and hopefully like elegance and finesse. But I would also hope that they would all taste different from each other, and all 4 of them could be different proofs. And so it's really kind of showcasing, as I was saying at the beginning, giving people an opportunity to see how the variability comes together. Again, in the wine industry, that's something we're very used to talking about. Oh, well, 2013 was extremely hot. And then you taste those wines and you understand that. And then you taste it against another vintage that they said, oh, this was a perfect growing season. And you can compare and contrast vintages. So to me, and again, this goes back to where I started, hopefully it's introducing a different conversation in the world of American whiskey around, okay, I have 4 ryes from 4 different years. They're all the same mash bill. They're roughly the same age, but look how different each one can taste from each other because of the variability due to the natural elements and all the ingredients.
I mean, I think as people start drinking or continue drinking more whiskey, as we've all seen, that's like, you know, such a hot, it's not an alcohol joke category, but you know, when we all started tasting wine, it was like, I don't know, this smells like wine. It smells like red wine. What do you want from me? And I feel like when I started drinking whiskey more seriously, it took a while for me to be able to pick out things, and even now still. So I feel like maybe as the educational curve doesn't flatten with whiskey, it'll be easier for people to appreciate nuance instead of appreciating just the burn.
My hope, and I say this with zero cynicism, right, is that on the one hand, people could just be like, it's a beautiful package, it's got a horse on it, and it tastes good, you know, and that it can live in that universe. And then by the same token, when, as you said, if people keep wanting to delve deeper and, you know, educate their palates more, then they can delve into, you know, the nuances and hopefully the things that we did to create these, you know, slight variabilities that are, you know, interesting.
I think, and affordable too, and like steeped in history, you know?
Thank you. Yeah. You know what? You actually bring up a good point that I think we talk about a lot, but we don't talk about enough, which is when this, and it goes back to this whole thing about Elijah Craig 18. I saw this industry, which what initially appealed to me was it's kind of like the most, in a great way, like the most humble American thing. It's like, it's corn, it's grain, it's distillate, you throw it in an oak barrel. It's very simple. Like there's not a lot to it. And it was something that was accessible. And then all of a sudden, maybe not quite to the extent of wine, but it became like, oh, you want that bottle? It's $3,000. Or you want that bottle? You'll never get it. You know, and I know from working specifically at Per Se, but also at Chanterelle, I got to taste these wines that unless you're in the industry or you're, you know, ridiculously wealthy, you will never taste those wines, ever. That's just a fact. No one's going to be like, oh, look, I just happen to have 1970 Margaux floating around. Like it's not going to happen for you. And what I liked about whiskey was its accessibility. And then to me, I mean, obviously we benefited from it in some ways, but whiskey's gotten a little bit more like that, where there's certain things that are pretty darn hard to get your hands on. They're rare. And if you could get them, they're really expensive. And so to me, it was important that Pinhook be affordable. And so, you know, it kind of depends on the market and depends on the retailer, but you know, our flagship, our everyday bourbon and rye are $35 on the shelf, essentially, maybe 37, 38. And our single barrels, the SRP anyway, is like $65. So I love the idea that we're trying to produce something with a lot of care and a lot of effort. And I hate the word, but I don't know a better one, craft, and, you know, really putting, which to me is not in the way that people mean it, but just putting a lot of time and effort into shaping something and making it taste great. And then also making it something that's like, of course you can, you know, go to Whole Foods in New Orleans and get Buffalo Trace for $22, and we can't compete with that at that scale, but you can also go to Whole Foods in New Orleans and get Pinhook for $33. So, you know, it's an affordable, it can be an everyday rye or bourbon for someone.
Is it your goal to keep it at that, I mean, close to that price point?
Yeah, and we haven't changed, you know, our price point has stayed the same, even when we transitioned into our Castle and Key distillate, which, you know, besides the fact that it costs more, also just would have been an easy opportunity and argument to make it more expensive, but we've kept it the same.
Are there any other things that you want to talk about that you didn't that we didn't touch on? I mean, single barrels, maybe single barrel programs is an option going forward if that's something you're interested in, or.
I think the other thing, yeah, single barrels. I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, it's such a small part of what we do, just because we don't really we're not at a point where we can manage like a really big single barrel program. So I think last year we did 54 single barrels for the entire country. Maybe this year we'll do 65. I think the other thing I wanted to mention though is, so this is essentially the year where we move from our, with the majority of the expressions, we move from MGP to Castle and Key. So you guys have Bourbon Country, which is our orange wax, flagship bourbon, which is currently MGP. This fall or kind of late summer will be our first orange wax, but it will be our Kentucky Castle and Key distillate. The one exception, which to me goes back to this idea of like experimentation, my history in wine, is our vertical series. So we have barrels of MGP remaining, and I was trying to think of something really fun that we could do with it, but also that would keep it separate from our Castle and Key distillate, both visually and just in terms of how people are thinking about it. And so the idea that I came up with was really just simply started with something that I'd always been curious about back when I owned Char No. 4, was really understanding the progression of age. So if you look at some of the bigger distilleries, you could buy, let's say Jim Beam, you could buy White Label and it's 4 years old, and you could buy Jim Beam Black and that's 8 years old, and then you could buy Knob Creek and maybe that's 9 years old, and then Baker's is 11 years old. I don't think all those ages are currently accurate, but at the time that's how it was. So you could kind of cobble together the impact of age, but never was there anything purely sequential. So the vertical series, which you all saw the first of, is a 4-year-old bourbon. And all the remaining bourbon barrels we have from MGP, when we bottled that, were all 4 years old, and essentially all had the same fill date, or at least within a month or two of each other. So we are doing an annual release of the vertical bourbon for 9 years. And so you're going to follow the whiskey as it ages from 4 to 12. So besides the obvious, which is, I think it's going to be very collectible and all that good stuff. It's never been done before over that length of time in the bourbon industry. And it's never been done in what would be considered the sweet spot of bourbon, age 4 to age 12. So I think hopefully it creates a lot of interesting conversations for people, and it has an educational component, because they're kind of like, wow, the transition from the 6-year-old to the 5-year-old, the transition from 5 to 6 was like super dramatic, or this is the year that we noticed the biggest jump, or at 9 years old, I think that's the point where it became too tannic and started to become too woody. And after that, it was good, but I didn't like those releases as much.
Yeah,
right?
I wish wine would do that too. Would be great.
And it's the inverse of wine, right? Because obviously wine ages in the bottle and essentially bourbon doesn't. So in order to do a vertical of bourbon, you have to do it where you start with a bunch of barrels, you grab a little chunk of them, you bottle them, you leave the rest in the barrel in the ricks, and then you grab another chunk of them, and so on and so forth. So the 12-year-old bourbon will be released in 2027. We're doing 150 barrels a year, so everyone's going to get an awesome education also in evaporation and just like economics, because I'm proofing each one to what I think is the best proof. And generally what I'm seeing is the proofs want to rise as the whiskey ages. It seems like as you get more intensity from the wood, it needs more weight from the alcohol to balance the wood. And so if every year the proofs go up, and then you're losing 4 to 5% to evaporation, and then losing whatever other percent. So who knows what the yield will be from 150 barrels in 2027. So the part that also excites me about this is we're doing the exact same thing with rye. And people have lots of arguments about, well, how does rye age compared to how does bourbon age? So we have MGP rye being released at the end of May as a 4-year-old, and the final rye vertical release will be a 12-year-old rye in 2028.
Got it.
That that to me is like, again, the type of, hopefully like experimentation and just having a different perspective on American whiskey that will create, fun, exciting, engaging experiences around American whiskey.
Can you then give a quick soundbite on what Bohemian is?
Yes. You mean just in terms of like mash bill, or?
Like a quick 30-second plug on what it is. And so many people on this are sales reps.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So I guess top level, Bohemian Bourbon is the first bourbon to come out of the Old Taylor Distillery since it was shut down in 1972. I do think, and I don't, audience-wise, if most people are sales reps, I think if people haven't heard of Castle and Key, they've obviously heard, or people, I would say buyers, if they haven't heard of Castle and Key, they've definitely heard of Old Taylor. So I think that's a really important selling point, is making that connection for them. It's our first ever Kentucky bourbon, which is a big deal too. The mash bill, 75% corn, 15% rye, 10% barley. I would call that a traditional mash bill, meaning if you were to look at the mash bills of a lot of distilleries, you would see something similar. I really like, especially with bourbon, we're really trying to play around with all these other things in the blending process and with the vintages, but I kind of like going for that classic flavor profile. So I think folks that love bourbon will be immediately drawn to this. I think what's amazing about it is it really, and again, this is easy to sell, but I guess in the end you have to taste people, but it really tastes older than its age. And I think that's a testament just to, and I think a big thing is the water, right? If there's a terroir in American whiskey, it would be the water, the barrel. We're also now, which is different from MGP, it's all non-GMO grain. As much sourced in Kentucky as possible, but most, if not Kentucky, Indiana, or, relatively close by. So I think those are the key points to me.
Well, thank you. We have a couple of more questions, but I think I'll email them to you if that's okay, since we're over on time. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys.
And thank you so much for expressing the specific sort of, like I said, instead of backing into a flavor profile, expressing forward a particular vintage and Rookholt expression.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to grab one thing that separates us from what everyone else is doing, that's really it. The idea of trying to make the best bourbon, not the same bourbon.